Last week, we talked about how to set healthy boundaries, how to identify that you need one, how to communicate one, and why healthy boundaries shouldn't destroy healthy relationships. They should strengthen them. But what happens afterward? Setting the boundary with my mother was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And then there was a whole lot of relief that it was actually completed. But then after that, there's a whole lot of decisions. So how do you live with this new boundary? If you've recently had a difficult conversation, or maybe you finally laid down the line and said no to something, or maybe you've taken a step back from a relationship, or maybe you've cut someone out of your life completely, and now you can't stop replaying that conversation in your head, or you're wondering if you were too harsh, or maybe you're just wondering what comes next. I want to tell you what I've learned from my experience so that maybe it helps you too. After more than a decade of learning, sometimes gracefully, sometimes not so much, I've realized that there's a lot of things that I didn't think about or nobody warned me about. Not about setting the boundary, but about what comes afterward. One of the best realizations I've had is that the anxiety always comes before the peace. But that means the peace is coming. Now, I've told you this before. I am terrible at setting boundaries in the moment. I wish I were one of the people that could just jump in and casually say, no, or I don't have the capacity for that this week, or sorry, that doesn't work for me, and then just move on with my day. I watch people do that, and honestly, I'm a little jealous because that's not me. I tend to rehearse my conversations. I rewrite over and over again the message that I'm going to send or the letter I'm going to write. I tend to catastrophize a little bit and imagine every possible response. I think about it while I'm driving or showering or while I'm trying to fall asleep before I've addressed it. I tend to just bundle in terms of anxiety before the confrontation. My brain is basically always running 20 different versions of the same conversation before it happens. And that hasn't really changed, even with therapy, even with learning healthier and positive communication, even after speaking publicly to you about trauma. I still hate confrontation. But I've noticed a really awesome pattern. And that is that every time I set a boundary, I feel relief afterward. Not because the other person suddenly agreed with me, or not because the relationship was magically fixed, but because I stopped fighting myself. One of the biggest examples of that is the letter I shared in my last video. For years, I carried around so much anger every time my mother ignored a boundary or pretended not to remember one, or she crossed another line. I felt like I had to start over again. And eventually, as I shared with you, my therapist suggested something very simple. Write it all down. Write her a letter. Everything. Not because it would change her. We knew it wouldn't, but because it might change me. So I did. I wrote page after page, every hurt, every disappointment, every boundary she crossed, the reason I needed those boundaries in the first place. And when I finally hit send, I expected to feel terrified of that response from her in return, but instead I felt quiet. Not victorious or like celebrating, but just quiet. And for the first time in a very long time, all of that anger wasn't bouncing and swirling in my head anymore. It was on paper. I had said what needed to be said. Whether she understood it or she accepted it was no longer my responsibility. I had given that away. And that feeling of lightness and just peace awed me, honestly. And I realized that that peace didn't come because she had magically changed. The peace came because I had finally stopped abandoning myself, and I had voiced and expressed those boundaries that I needed to express, put them down, and I felt good about it. Since then, I've noticed the exact same thing with much smaller boundaries, saying no to another commitment or telling someone I don't have the emotional capacity for a conversation or just admitting that I don't have time to take one more thing on my plate. Every single time, the lead up for me is almost always the hardest part. My anxiety tells me that I'm going to ruin the relationship, or I'm going to disappoint someone, or that they'll be angry with me, that they'll think less of me. But then most of the time, none of those things happen, or at least not in the way I've imagined. Instead, there's that same relief. I've set another boundary. Not relief because everything's perfect, it will never be perfect, but because I've been honest with myself. But then something else happens after setting that boundary. Other people start having opinions and they start reacting to that boundary. And honestly, I think sometimes that can be even more frustrating than setting the boundary itself, because I do believe people genuinely mean well, and many times they support you, but sometimes they question you, and that's okay too. Sometimes, however, they decide they know your situation somehow better than you do, and sometimes they simply don't understand at all. And that can be incredibly lonely and disheartening, especially if you've spent years second guessing yourself already. And so one of the things I've had to learn over the years is that understanding and respect are two completely different things. For a very long time, I thought that if I could just explain myself well enough to family, to friends, to whoever, if I could tell my story one more time, I could help people understand what growing up in my family was actually like. And surely they would agree with my decision, whether it was cutting off my mother or whatever that may be. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. There are still many people in this world who believe children should always have a relationship with their parents, that their parents are somehow close to godliness and should always be quote unquote respected, that family is family, and that forgiveness automatically means reconciliation. And I do understand why many people believe that. I think if you've grown up in a healthy family, that's probably a pretty reasonable assumption, actually. It's just, it's not one that applies to every family. And I've spent a long time in my life trying to convince people that my boundaries make sense. And eventually, I had to make peace with the fact that I don't actually need everyone's agreement. I just need to trust my own judgment. Because here's the thing, people don't have to understand your boundary in order to respect it. That being said, one of the biggest positive lessons I've learned in this boundary setting journey is that healthy people usually respond very well to boundaries, surprisingly well. In fact, sometimes I've found boundaries actually strengthen relationships. I remember sitting in a search and rescue leadership meeting recently when someone simply said, "Hey, work's really busy right now. I won't be able to keep up with XYZ timeline, but I'll get my part done and I'll get it done by X date." Just setting expectations. And that was it. There was no apology or guilt or excuses, no 20-minute explanation about why they couldn't keep up with the other person who was able to work much faster than they were because they're retired and they have the time. They were just having honest communication, and the meeting moved on. Nobody questioned their commitment to the team or accused them of being lazy. Everyone just simply adjusted their expectations and we moved on. And I remember thinking to myself, I wish boundary setting came as naturally for me as it did for her, because that's what healthy boundaries actually look like. It's not about conflict. It's about that clarity and that communication. And I've noticed the same thing in many healthy relationships over the years. When I've told someone that something is hurting me or hurting my feelings, or maybe I need to step back from something, or that I can't commit to something right now, healthy people respond positively or with curiosity. And especially if you feel like they've wronged you in some way and you're communicating that, oftentimes they don't even realize they crossed a boundary. And sometimes they apologize or We have a really good conversation about what we feel comfortable with, and that relationship can actually become stronger because now we understand each other better. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about boundaries is this assumption that boundaries create distance between people, when sometimes they actually create and help build trust, because healthy people want to know how to love and respect you well and in a way that you feel loved and respected. If you've recently set a boundary and you're replaying every word you said, or wondering if you overreacted, or wondering if you made the right decision, I just want you to know that what you're feeling is incredibly normal. The anxiety, the relief, the second guessing, the frustration when other people don't understand, all of it. Because setting the boundary, unfortunately, wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning most of the time. So in the next video, we'll talk about learning to live with the boundaries that you've set and navigating the day-to-day within those new boundaries. So we'll see you then. Thanks for being here with me. I'm Janae Cherie, and I hope that my story helps you to tell yours.